that was a good deal. So we could go to Fish and Wildlife or Fish and Game, especially federal agencies, go to the Forest Service or the National Park Service or BLM and say, we have you've indicated an interest in some area, and we can, if you support a student with say a grant of $10,000 to $15,000 at that time, that would cover a lot, and they would provide logistics support too, like Fish and Game would get more money through logistics support sometimes with aircraft support, and it was good for the students because the students were then sometimes working with the federal biologists, whereas if they had to hire somebody to do the study, it would have cost them megabucks compared to having the student do the work. So it was good for the agencies to get these projects done, but it was particularly good for the students to get to work with agency people, and frequently it led to their getting jobs after they finished up.
It was a very, very successful program for the Department of Fish and Game, an excellent apprenticeship program, yeah.
Most of our, in the early days, most of all of our graduates went to Fish and Game and worked there. Well, that was good because it was growing organization and growing responsibilities and funding. Federal aid and wildlife restoration work was increasing, and so that was a good deal.
And was it a good deal for you and your career to have worked there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was happy to working there, and it was good in so many ways. I mean, I was there with other scientists, and it kept me on my toes that way. And I'm a social person too. I mean, I liked being around. I loved working in Petersburg, but it was pretty isolated from contact with people that had similar interests. I mean, the Norwegian fishermen were nice people, but if you
Not wildlife biologists.
they're not wildlife biologists, and they don't think the same as you do. I mean, you could have common conversations, especially if you're both hunters. Yeah. But it was socially wasn't the greatest place. So I appreciated being with people where you can sit down and discuss and argue with too, and times.
Mm-hmm. So you feel like you've made the right choice to have gone into wildlife management?
Yeah, I've become more of an ecologist as I've matured, but basically that was my start, and I still feel trying to understand natural systems, and especially natural systems where we don't. That's one of the attractions of being Alaska rather than, say, Missouri or other where it's good wildlife going, but a lot of it's related to land use, and we don't have that much of that here in Alaska. There's problems, but there are different kind of problems that, like Kodiak Island with ranching cattle in the brown bear country, for example, and other problems with the bison in Delta, where probably, the amount of time that Fish and Game and Fish and Wildlife before spent on management of those bison compared to what they should spend on caribou or moose work was huge and has been huge. And that's the same way with getting hung up on things like wolf management and bear management, is that frequently those focus on trying to understand the basic relationship between the animals and their environment. And the wolves are part of it, and the bears are part of it, but the vegetation is an important part of it. And that's what I feel, what was the real loss in moving from territory with federal management was there was a big focus on habitat under federal management. It's understandable because they own all the land too. When statehood came, then it was attitude of the new Department of Fish and Game was their job was to learn more about animal populations and numbers, and because state has to allocate harvests among potential users, and most of the land was still in federal ownership, and so the state felt like federal government should take more of responsibility for habitat. Well, on federal lands, they did but not on BLM lands. You see, it was on mostly Park Service and Forest Service lands.
Pat, you were a student of Dave's, is that correct?
Fred Dean was actually my major professor, but Dave was on my committee.
Yeah.
And I worked on grizzly bears north of Denali Park, and that was in the early and mid-1970s. But since then, Dave and I have maintained a fairly close relationship and cooperated on caribou projects and whatnot.
Because you went on to work for Fish and Game.
I went on to work for
studied
Fish and Game.
caribou.
I went on to work for Fish and Game in 1977. I worked for Fish and Game for 28 years as a caribou biologist.
So Dave is very humble and doesn't necessarily talk about his contributions and accomplishments. As a fellow caribou biologist, can you comment on what his contributions to the field have been?
Yeah, Dave's contributions have been tremendous to not only caribou biology, but biology of northern ungulates in general. And, you know, as he mentioned, his variety of graduate students from all over the world working on such a variety of mountain species like goats and sheep and muskox and moose and caribou provided a tremendous melting pot that we all really appreciated. All of the graduate students that we interacted with, you know, I worked on caribou, but I very much enjoyed talking and working with Dave's students on moose and sheep and all of the other species. So Dave's leadership at the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit created this focal point for biologists from both the Fish and Wildlife Service and BLM and the Department of Fish and Game to gather occasionally at the university for various graduate student seminars, thesis defenses, you know, all of those kinds of things, and then social functions after those kinds of things, and then field trips as well. So when you put that all together, Dave's contribution to wildlife management in Alaska is really hard to overestimate. I think it's one of the most phenomenal contributions of any single person to the field of wildlife management that I can think of in the history of the profession. So it's really a phenomenal thing.
Okay.
The one point though that Pat mentioned, which is an important point, and it was important in my career, and that is the international connections, and that 6 months in Denmark the first time was doing a study of rodeo. It was sort of like a sabbatical leave, but I had to go with the family, and I had to save up vacation time, and I had to find a rental for a house, and then I did the same thing for a full year, and we had the Fulbright grant to cover travel expenses, but had to work out a deal. In both cases, I worked out a deal where the research was done in collaboration with the Danes in Denmark, and then the Norwegians at the University of Oslo, where I gave some lectures, etc. But I was involved in research there. And then this stimulated more connections, and with all the Scandinavian countries and Finland, and then official exchanges with Russia and with the Soviet Union under the Nixon-Brezhnev detente agreement on science exchanges. This was Arctic work, making connections with people, and the Scandinavian ones, and then some of my grad students were from Canada, and so it was this circum-Arctic experiences of me, and that was stimulated.
And those kinds of connections led to graduate students who
Yeah.
came to Alaska.
And we had official exchanges
right.
with the University of Copenhagen, as well as the Agricultural University in Norway, and this thing just continued to grow, and in a very positive way for me. And I've had postdocs over from those that worked with Fish and Game and did studies, and it was, to me, things couldn't have gone better in terms of what I had aspired for, but also I gained so much more that I wasn't aware how important these international connections were, as well as connections in North America. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I did, are we still on? Mm-hmm. One of the things I did as a co-op unit leader in the early days is I tried to convince our supervisor in Washington, D.C. that we ought to have exchanges between the units. You know, the unit leaders and assistant leaders we should have exchanges, and the guy who was heading us up then, Reed Goforth, was he thought that's a good idea, but I don't see how we can do that with a budget. And I said, well, if we did these exchanges, so we'd keep it down to a minimum and be a 2-week exchange, so you wouldn't have to fill somebody in, and so and we'd live in the unit leader's home, vice versa, when they came and for a visit, and we'd involve them in activities. And so I worked out the first exchange for the unit program was with Ohio Cooperative Unit and Alaska, and the unit leader there was a terrific guy, and people, another unit said, how come you would go to exchange with Ohio? There's not much there. From Alaska? Alaska, maybe, but not. And I said, that was a terrific trip because
There's no mountains in Ohio.
But the sad, wonderful waterfowl marshes, and he took me around, and then I took him up in the north, and we did a ski trip, and he managed to freeze a toe in a snow cave up the Natigan Canyon. And I did the same with the Arizona assistant unit leader, who was an ardent photographer, and I included him on the field trip down to Southeast Alaska. And oh man, it was so great to have someone like that along with the students. I mean, not just me, and I did this and other one when we had what's his name, that was from Montana. He did a sabbatical here. Another name that doesn't pop into my mind. Mm. But to have these people coming through and get involved in unit programs and to me it was, I was creating a learning environment that was so good for the students, as well as for me, and for the person who was visiting. So at any rate, that thing never went beyond 3 exchanges that I was involved with.
Yeah, I think that's a key statement right there, creating a really good learning environment over the years. I think that's probably, you hit the nail on the head there, Dave. That's probably...
Yeah. Well, some of the things we did, which was sort of a unit, but was that Schiss Creek cabin,
right? Yeah.
A tent camp, and I had to go and get a permit, to do this, but it was I couldn't have done it by myself.
Yeah, we had a whole train of people on skis hauling sleds, and
we hauled in this stuff, which was
And on the way, you get to see ptarmigan and caribou. And
it was an
mountain sheep
expedition,
and, so.
but it was a team effort, and there was so much terrific people. I mean,
a virtual good morning to you all. It's good to be able to imagine only smiling faces out there and not a bunch of scowls. My name is Bob Ritchie, a co-founder of ABR Inc. Environmental Research and Services, formerly Alaska Biological Research. I retired in 2018 with 40 years of experience emphasizing raptors and waterfowl and managing a small business. I'd like to thank Tom and the Wildlife Society for inviting me to this panel today. I reckon the panel has at least 200 years of field experience, a few good stories and jokes, and at least some pearls of wisdom. My goal today is to present my perspective as a wildlife consultant about wildlife conservation in Alaska, some history, and describe how consulting can increase the conservation value of its research. First, a little background. ABR is an employee-owned environmental research and consulting firm in Alaska. Its staff of 35, many UAF graduates, represents a number of disciplines, including wildlife and fisheries science, land rehabilitation services, landscape ecology, and database management, and others. They worked on a wide range of projects, from small site-specific ones to large development assessments, building a reputation for solid research, creativity, and timeliness. Our clients and partners have been as diverse as our jobs and have included numerous industries, government agencies, universities, local communities, and in Alaska and in other states. Our mission is to provide science-based consulting services to those who conserve, manage, or develop natural resources within a socially and environmentally responsible workplace. ABR's business follows a triple bottom line of economic viability, social commitment, and environmental stewardship. Now, my choosing a private research instead of a more traditional pathway to use my expertise was influenced by a lot of early experiences, including visiting Alaska in 1970 to volunteer for the Alaska Conservation Society, developing a graduate program with Dave Klein as my advisor on the Yukon River, and short stints with the Fish and Wildlife Service and consulting firm after graduation. I have to say, as a side note, I always wondered why Dave Klein came with me during the hunting season to visit me in the field. In 1976, I joined another UAF graduate, Jim Curtola, and hatched this idea for Alaska Biological Research. With gross revenues of $2,500 in the first year, we thought we'd be nonprofit by default. But maybe the two most influential reasons that we stayed on this business track were new federal laws and a number of large development projects that would change the face of conservation in the state. First, I think the settlement of statewide land claims with the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971 was critical. Combined with other major federal mandates like the Endangered Species Act and NEPA and the 1980 Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act of 1980, we saw a need for more professionals to engage in environmental work. One way to appreciate the magnitude of these needs and then some of the challenges that might come with it would be to look at maps of Alaska in 1968 and after land claim settlements. In 1968, it really was a barren canvas. There weren't many boundaries of anything. But by the 80s, it was a tapestry of complex ownership boundaries and then the challenges that would come with that. Coupled with these federal laws, there were large projects and programs that would provide numerous opportunities to private and public research opportunities. We got involved in many of these within about 5 years, hired additional biologists and increasing our skills, and built the small business that exists today. Along the way, we experienced some aspects of private consulting that probably aren't unique, but hard to plan for. Diminished funding for projects, clients pulling the plug for numerous reasons, Projects like the EVOS immersed in lawsuits from day one, hindering interactions with agency personnel, which we had always found so valuable. Also changing federal administrations, weakening laws, and complicating what we could offer our clients. But in all of our work, we subscribe to basic scientific standards to bolster our credibility, including using established practices, maintaining honesty in data collection and reporting, following independence of thought and not advocacy for projects, and emphasizing consistency, repeatability, and documentation. Although the interests of many clients are often short-term and may be tied to a singular permit stipulation, designing work to meet a broader objective of conservation that would be valuable to developers and regulators was what we really sought. I'll show a few examples of some of these projects in our next slides where I think satisfying client needs and improving conservation value of the research were not exclusive. First of all, we began monitoring peregrines, a passion of mine, in 1977, joining a number of other private and public researchers determining the status of these birds in Alaska. Our surveys, particularly in remote part of northern Alaska foothills and on the Yukon-Tanana uplands, both increased our understanding of the recovery and expansion of peregrines in the state. We also managed a number of studies to monitor waterbirds in the oil fields and adjacent areas, including brant and snow geese, eiders, yellow-billed loons, and tundra swans. Support and collaboration with scientists and stakeholders, oil companies, North Slope Borough, federal agency, and local villages have been essential to the continuity of these programs and their usefulness in any avian conservation. Valuable conservation products include our 15 to 20-year banding data sets and recommendations to protect important wetland habitats in the oil fields. ABR began working with Caribou in the expanding oil fields in 1981. It was actually one of our first big projects, starting with applied research on caribou responses to infrastructure and traffic. Caribou movements and seasonal use are still monitored annually, and those have been improved by telemetry and agency partnering. Conservation values have included understanding industry effects on caribou and applying that knowledge to improving oil fields and operations. ABR joined others in reinvigorating the use of mobile radar lab to study bird migration beginning in 1987 in over-the-horizon backscatter studies in Alaska and Minnesota. Conservation values of our work have included developing protocols which have become standards for assessing endangered seabirds in the Hawaiian Islands and marble murrelets in the Pacific Northwest, as well as siting infrastructure on a number of our projects. Since 1983, ABR's rehabilitation group, or land rehabilitation group, has worked at numerous disturbed sites in Alaska and some in Canada. We've emphasized reestablishment of native vegetation, created and restored wetlands, and reduced and mitigated disturbed tundra. We've developed treatment protocols, incorporated local knowledge at some sites, and restored habitat values. Our partners have included oil and mining companies and resource agencies. Ecological land survey is an integrated ecosystem-based approach for natural resource inventory. It integrates field data with remote sensing data to classify and map ecosystem properties. Since 1992, ABR has applied this approach to over 40 million acres in Alaska. Map products support diverse applications related to resource management, including impact assessment, contingency planning, and habitat mapping. In all of these projects, our collaboration with a diverse group of scientists has improved opportunities to increase funding sources and drawn on larger data sets, ultimately increasing their conservation value. Our data management and field protocol documentation has evolved to foster greater reproducibility of our work, And data sets are now more easily combined to compare them across projects. And most clients are not opposed to these values added to what we collect for them on their projects. Finally, results of some of these projects help stakeholders outside of our partners, like flyway councils and endangered species recovery teams. In keeping with our triple bottom line, ABR has made resource conservation a basic tenet of our business practices. Some of our initiatives that have been recognized by the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation's Pollution Prevention Awards are listed in the accompanying slide. Most satisfying to me is that in 2000, we started to calculate our carbon footprint and identify ways to mitigate or offset our business's carbon emissions. Annually, we estimate our carbon. We calculate a tax using market values per ton of carbon that we produce, and then support projects that sequester or reduce carbon emissions with that tax. Since 2000, we've invested in initiatives to offset roughly 10,000 tons of carbon with wind energy projects in Western Alaska villages, waste methane to energy projects in the Pacific Northwest, and land preservation projects in the US. Oh, finally, as a side note, Inc. magazine recognizes a long time for our alternative transportation support for our employees, claiming that in their article, mushing used as travel to remote Alaskan environmental consulting company. Our community involvement, like many organizations, includes support for volunteering, but we've also supported larger volunteering efforts through a loosely defined philosophy called BioShare for funding interns and assisting nonprofits with their own resource inventories and supporting underfunded projects. Today, opportunities for consultants to directly and indirectly influence conservation in Alaska are still abundant. In a world that has a greater need to assess global change and transition to greener energy, engage in social reform and listen to science, I'm confident that our research can help. This slide I have up now is meant to highlight a current project in our landscape ecologies team that reflects our response to these needs and opportunities. ABR has been involved in monitoring long-term change in the Waikiki Delta for many years, partnering with a wide range of stakeholders from local knowledge holders to resource agencies and universities, and currently is being supported by NASA. We recognize that investing in innovative technologies and skill sets like those employed in this project are more critical now than ever to address rapidly changing social and ecological issues. We're most excited when we can contribute directly to conservation, but for most projects involving developmental client interests, we still need to establish the conservation connection of our research to the client's needs. I think this can be best achieved by continuing to work with clients and respect the science that's needed and value collaboration. I think that their continued support for our distribution of our data projects and reports and publications is an excellent testimony to our efforts to increase conservation values of our research. Tom asked me to offer some recommendations to the audience today. So they might include, don't volunteer to do a virtual presentation after you retire. Of course, that regret is just formally recorded now. Here are some real recommendations. Wherever you work, remember that honesty and integrity are fundamental to your credibility. You don't need to advocate for a project. You need to provide technical support. Pick a good company or agency to work for where creative and enthusiastic work are promoted. Support clients with strong science within their organizations. The potential for some of your best work may come from partnering with those like-minded professionals. Maybe more than ever, clear communication and collaboration is critical to advance our conservation needs. More an introspection than a recommendation, I just say that I've been very fortunate and will continue to share my good fortune. So just don't get too busy with your careers that you don't have time to reflect on the world outside yours, which may often seem very overwhelming. It is for many people. Before I end, I'd like to thank a number of retired and current ABR colleagues listed in this final slide, who offered their ideas throughout my career and with help in treating and creating this presentation. Without any bias, ABR's greatest asset is its remarkable group of scientists and supporting staff. Thank you for your attention. I've completely run out of time for a joke, and I wish only I could hear your applause.
Good morning again, everyone. I'm John Schoen, and I worked for 20 years for Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and then I worked for 14 years for Audubon, Alaska. Interestingly, both organizations actually had similar conservation missions. However, I did find myself pushing the envelope on conservation with the agency and pushing the envelope on science with the NGO. In my work at Audubon, I was involved in developing conservation strategies for both the Tongass Forest and the Western Arctic. Looking back over my career, I found that the following 8 principles helped in guiding my conservation work over the last 4 decades. First, conservation is job one. As scientists and conservation practitioners, it's our responsibility to evaluate the management of our public lands and waters and long-term effects that management has on our nation's fish and wildlife. Our overarching goal is to ensure that this natural heritage will endure long after we are gone. And our planning horizon should be in decades and centuries, not short-term election cycles. For example, if we clear-cut an old-growth forest, it will take several centuries to regain the structure and function of an old-growth ecosystem. Number 2, it's all about the ecosystem. Today, habitat loss and fragmentation are 2 of the most significant challenges that cause species extinction, and those are now compounded by climate change. Aldo Leopold said that the first principle of conservation is to save all the parts. All the parts of the ecosystem include distinct populations, species, habitat types, ecological communities, and ecosystem structure, function, and processes. Essentially, that's the definition of biodiversity. Each year, millions of salmon spawn and rear in thousands of Alaska rivers, streams, and lakes. Salmon anchor the productivity of South Coastal Alaska. Over 100 species of birds, mammals, fish, and invertebrates use salmon for food. On the Kenai Peninsula, Grant Hildebrand estimated that female brown bears consume over 2,000 pounds of salmon in a season. Bears are considered a keystone species because of their influence on the ecosystem, including dispersing marine-derived nutrients throughout the floodplain and beyond. Scientists have discovered marine nitrogen in bear hair, bird feathers, foliage of spruce, hemlock, salmonberry, and other plants and animals. Many of the ecological parts of this ecosystem are inextricably linked. And I know that may sound like a cliche, but really that's reality. Some habitat types are rare, but provide important habitat for many species. Ecosystem integrity requires that all the parts play a functional role. Just maintaining minimal viable populations is not adequate. Number 3, science matters. Science provides important tools for making informed decisions. We have a responsibility to ensure that peer-reviewed science is part of the decision-making process and that scientific findings are made accessible and clearly explained to decision makers and the public. But just publishing agency reports and even peer-reviewed papers is not good enough anymore. We must do a better job informing the public and decision makers about implications of our research. Number 4, integrity is fundamental. When we don't know, we must be honest and say we don't know and never exaggerate. My rule of thumb has always been to err on the side of understatement. Credibility is our most important asset, and we must steadfastly protect it. Now, I want to share just a brief story. 15 to 20 years ago, I was back in DC at a national environmental discussion with a bunch of groups talking about conservation in the Arctic. And it was actually NPRA, and Audubon had been involved in developing a conservation strategy for NPRA. And an attorney came up to me and really challenged me and said, we really need to expand this area of protection. And I pushed back and I said, look, we worked with Fish and Wildlife Service, we worked with Fish and Game and the university scientists, and what I'm presenting is a consensus of the best science we have. Well, I prevailed and we went ahead with our strategy. And the final area plan for NPRA under the Obama administration was pretty darn close to what Audubon has proposed. And I think the key here is that if you say you're going to use science, you really need to be true to your science. So I didn't get pushed by that attorney. And I think we prevailed in the fact that I talked to one of the Obama leaders of the Department of Interior after that decision had been made, and he told me that they selected their preferred alternative based on good science and the fact that what Audubon was proposing, we didn't get all of what we wanted, but we got a lot of it, and we didn't overreach. So I think if you use science, you have to be true to the science. Okay, this is number 5, principle. Speak truth to power. Our basic message and facts should not change. Policymakers may not agree, but we should not be intimidated by positions of power. Now, agencies are like big ships. It takes a lot of time to change course, and some bureaucratic leaders don't want to rock the boat. However, I strongly believe that each of us, each of the wildlifers, has a responsibility to take our knowledge up to the next level. We need to talk to our supervisor and make sure that our supervisors understand the facts. And memos make great paper trails. And this is something that is very important. Now, number 6, work cooperatively and seek out partnerships. This is, I think, a significant point. We need to move beyond state versus feds, conservation versus agencies. Oftentimes you get into bottlenecks, conservation NGOs arguing with Fish and Game or the Fish and Wildlife Service or the BLM. Personally, one of the most rewarding experiences I've had working in Alaska and working with Audubon was participating on the Western Arctic Caribou Working Group. The working group was committed to the long-term conservation of the Western Arctic herd and the ecosystem on which it depends, working with diverse interests, all sharing the common ground of conserving the herd. Professional societies like the Wildlife Society can play a very important role in assessing and commenting on conservation policy. As an example, recently, Mike Spindler led an excellent comprehensive review of BLM's Central Yukon Area DEIS. And these were submitted to BLM by our President Kim on behalf of the Alaska chapter. I believe that building relationships and collaborating with colleagues outside our organizational boundaries is really important. And the Wildlife Society, the Alaska chapter, has been able to facilitate some of those relationships. Now, number 7, these are all important, I think, but this is a really significant issue. Alaska is unique, and our stewardship responsibilities are significant. There are no other states in our nation and few places left on Earth where we still have vast, intact ecosystems with all their ecological parts. For example, Alaska encompasses 63% of our nation's wetlands, 80% of our nation's wildlife refuge lands, and 100% of our nation's Arctic lands. And combined with northern British Columbia, the greatest extent of intact temperate ecosystem, temperate rainforest on Earth. In the lower 48 states, restoration ecology is the norm. But in Alaska, we still have unparalleled opportunities for conserving wildlife in intact ecosystems with all their functional parts. But conservation challenges are significant and include big issues like clear-cutting old-growth rainforest on the Tongass, still an issue, oil and gas development and marine and terrestrial Arctic, a major mining development in the headwaters of Bristol Bay, and all of these things are affected with climate change. Consider Alaska's coastal plain. Other than a narrow strip next to the Canadian border, there are no permanently protected conservation units in our nation's only Arctic coastal plain. But the last administration essentially opened nearly the entire coastal plain for energy development. Science in that administration took a back seat to decision making. Considering the potential ecological impacts of those decisions in combination with accelerated climate change, it would seem prudent to develop a comprehensive plan for permanent protection of important wildlife habitats in America's Arctic, including in the Arctic Refuge and National Petroleum Reserve, before considering additional commitments to develop energy resources across Alaska's North Slope. With good science and analytical tools, I have confidence that the Alaska chapter will play a significant role in addressing these difficult challenges. And over the next 50 years, our grandchildren will thank you. Okay, my final principle, and I think this one is really important. Seek balance in your life. It's difficult to be effective and maintain a passion for work on something you don't value or understand. I've seen devoted conservation people start out working nearly 24/7, but most people can't maintain that pace and they burn out after a few years. To be effective over the long term, you need to have a balance in your life. You need to take time to go hunting and fishing and birding and hiking and spending time with your family. The restorative quality of getting outdoors and maintaining a connection with nature enhances job effectiveness and the joy of living well. Sharing experiences in nature with family and friends is priceless. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Doug Larsen. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to begin by thanking Tom Paraguay and the conference committee for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's really an honor to be with this group of longtime friends and well-respected colleagues, all of whom have served as mentors to me in one way or another over the years. I've titled my talk today, Synergize for Success, because as I thought back over my years of working with wildlife, I found myself repeatedly reflecting on successful projects and how they all benefited from a broad collection of individuals and organizations that came together with a common purpose and a common goal. I thought of 9 different examples of where synergy was key in the success of projects in my career. Today, I'm going to share 2 of those. The first is a census of brown bears that we did back in 1987 in the Noatak Valley. And the second is a goat transplant that took place on Revilla Island in 1991. Well, it seems fitting that if we're going to talk about synergy, we probably all need to be on the same page about what that is. According to the dictionary, synergy is the interaction of or cooperation of 2 or more organizations, substances, or other agents to produce a combined effect greater than the sum of their separate effects. In other words, 1 + 1 is something greater than 2. Or, still other words, benefits become exponential rather than additive. So with that, I'd like to start by talking about the Noatak Valley Bear Census. This was pulled off with a large cadre of organizations and individuals. And you can see in this photo, there were agencies, Park Service, Fish and Game. We had the community of Noatak. We had Fish and Game advisory committees. We had the U.S. National Guard. We had NANA Corporation, the Northwest Arctic Borough, air taxi operators. And importantly, we had elders from the communities of Kotzebue and Noatak. The photo that you see here is of those individuals who were actually involved in the field work, but there was a whole host and cadre of people behind the scenes that made this possible. Well, at the time, the biological considerations were that there was high interest in brown bear hunting, especially by guided hunters, but there was a lack of knowledge on our part about bear numbers and what the harvestable surplus should be. So it was very important that we get that kind of information if we were going to responsibly manage, which of course we wanted to do. There were also social and cultural considerations. Bears are deeply respected by the Inupiaq Eskimos, and the idea of capturing and handling bears really created some discomfort, especially among many of the elders in the region. Well, we had a respect for local culture and knowledge, and it was largely because of my supervisor at the time and longtime friend and colleague, David James, who I know many of you know. He built into his management programs an important component, at least he felt it was important. I agree with him. And that was that we needed to invest time and effort talking with people, understanding their culture, their backgrounds, their knowledge, what kinds of things they saw as issues or concerns, and by the same token, share with them some of our perspectives on wildlife management and conservation. The other person that was very influential for me in this same regard was Mike Spindler, who's one of our panel members today. Mike was working with the Fish and Wildlife Service at the time in Kotzebue, and like David, he saw the value in investing time and effort, sitting with people, talking with them, getting to know who they are, what their backgrounds are, and as best he could, what their concerns were and how they could be dealt with. David and others also spent considerable time talking with the leaders in the region. This photo shows the leadership from the Northwest Arctic Borough back at the time we did the census. And again, the value was seen in spending time and talking with these people to appreciate their perspectives and not force something on them, but rather work cooperatively towards a common goal. We also had the benefit, because of David's work and others, of going into villages and spending time with the people. The people of Noatak, which was the area where this census was being done, became very involved. They actually appreciated knowing what was going on and actually got interested in it. They opened their airport to us. They provided a place where we could put fuel, where we could stage aircraft. And the National Guard in Noatak gave us their Quonset, which was a large facility for us to do lodging and cooking for the several days that we spent doing this census. So it really was because of that building of rapport and credibility and trust that this actually was able to be pulled off in the region. Well, pulling off the census was, of course, not easy. Logistically, there's always challenges, but it was possible, again, because of the groundwork that was done ahead of time. In the end, we were able to do what we needed to do in tagging bears, doing capture, recapture. We were able to come up with an estimate of population, which turned out to be 1 bear per 16 square miles, which if you compare that to John Shane's work down on Admiralty, which was 1 bear per square mile. We're talking about 1/16 the density. But the point was, we now had information that we could use to responsibly manage the harvest of bears in that part of Northwest Alaska. So reflecting on some of the lessons that I learned through that effort. First of all, building relationships takes time and energy, especially in cross-cultural settings. And I can't overemphasize the amount of energy it takes, because when you go out to communities and you sit in their homes, and as much as you want to be relaxed and stuff, you're always kind of on edge because you're trying to learn and pick things up. And especially in a cross-cultural setting, it can be extremely exhausting, but extremely valuable. In fact, it's easy to forego this kind of informational gathering in lieu of the scientific data. I mean, we are scientists. That's what we do. We collect data, numbers, information about critters. It's all important stuff, obviously, but you can't underestimate the value of this building relationships. Trust and respect, I found, are absolutely critical to the success of effective and lasting wildlife conservation efforts. And taking time to build open, honest, and sincere relationships, and frankly, friendships, can lead to synergistic success, which is exactly what we saw in the case of the Noatak bear census. The second example I want to share with you was the Revilla Island goat transplant that happened back in 1991. Here again, there were a lot of entities involved in this. Revilla Island, for those of you who aren't familiar with that part of Southeast or part of Alaska, is where COWCH located in the southern part of Southeast Alaska. For that effort, we had agencies, Fish and Game, Forest Service. We had a group of individuals with the COWCH Sports and Wildlife Club, a very active and involved group. We had a representative from the legislature. We had a local veterinarian. We had several companies, including the COWCH Pulp Company, Eichner Helicopters, South Coast Incorporated. We had an Alaska Tug and Barge Company, Sealy Corporation, Temsco Helicopters, and we even had KTOO Public Broadcasting. So a broad variety and array of participants to make this effort happen. So at the time, the social and political considerations were that mountain goats had already been successfully introduced on Revilla Island in 1983, so about 8 years earlier, and that was done as part of a mitigative process for the mining that was done in Misty Fjords for molybdenum. COWCH Sports and Wildlife Club had a history of requesting wildlife introductions, and they had actually successfully lobbied the legislature with former Representative Robin Taylor's support to introduce elk on Edlin Island in 1987. So we knew there was political capital with them. In 1990, the COWCH Sports and Wildlife Club came to Fish and Game and asked that more goats be introduced on Revilla Island, but this time closer to COWCH, where they'd be more accessible for both hunting and viewing. Well, the biological considerations were such that mountain goats had already been introduced on Revilla, so we had that history with us. The preliminary observations showed that the habitat was capable of supporting goats with no notable competition with indigenous wildlife. Fish and Game and the Forest Service staff had conducted a review of available habitat adjacent to COWCH, and the determination was made that indeed there was sufficient escape terrain, wintering timber stands, and forage foods to support a goat population. And because of the results from that habitat review, the transplant request was approved. So then it was a matter of assembling a team and putting a plan in place. And again, we had a lot of interest by the community, both in terms of equipment and personnel. So we had people like you see in the photo here to the left, Miles Enright and Ken Eichner. Ken Eichner, the gentleman on the right there, actually started Temsco Helicopters many years ago. But you can see in the background here, and this photo was taken in Misty Fjords National Monument. We had a barge, a tug, we had private aircraft, airplanes, we had helicopters for capturing and for doing the actual transport of goats. So we had a lot invested in this from personal investments and personal interest. The photo on the right shows a gentleman with glasses on. That was our local veterinarian in COWCH, Vern Starks, and he participated in helping to plan the transplant, as well as actually participated and helped with the goats on the day of the transplant. Pulling off the transplant was like we do with all wildlife programs. I mean, safety was paramount, of course, and we were fortunate. Everybody was safe throughout that effort. we had, again, all this equipment. We had helicopters for capturing, we had helicopters for transporting, we had airplanes circling to find goats for that we could go in and target. We had a lot of volunteers that were helping to keep goats safe and comfortable after they'd been immobilized and brought to the staging area before being transported to the release site. In the end, we captured 15 mountain goats, 5 billies and 10 nannies, and they were taken to Revilla Island on August 10th of 1991 and released at a place called Mahoney Lake, right behind Ketchikan. Now, the cost at the time would have been around $47,500 without the donated labor and equipment. And in this slide, you'll see a table that shows the breakdown of those from a report we did back when the transplant occurred. With inflation, the cost today would have been around $91,700, almost $92,000. So you can see it was an incredible investment of personal capital that was made on behalf of this effort by locals. There are now over 375 mountain goats in the transplant area based on data from Fish and Game. Goats now provide accessible viewing and hunting opportunities for residents and non-residents. So it was a very successful effort. Thinking about reflecting on the lessons learned, volunteers can be a huge asset to productive and successful wildlife conservation efforts. They bring expertise, they bring equipment, you get buy-in, you get joint ownership, it becomes a win-win and everybody's invested. Industry, with their different perspectives, can actually be valued partners. Industry personnel and agency biologists can actually become good friends, and this is exactly what happened in the case of our interactions in Ketchikan. Respectful discussions of differing views and perspectives can be informative and valuable, and when you don't agree, you just agree to disagree. Relationships can actually enable additional opportunities. So for example, following the goat work, we were able to do bear work, wolf work, elk work, goshawk work, and even deer work with the aid of industry helicopters and pilots. That was all because of the relationship we'd formed and our ability to find common ground and then work together to pull off efforts. So with that as background and some scenarios relative to synergy, I wanted to talk a little bit about preparing for the future. And I thought to do that, I would reflect a little bit on some lessons I've learned over the years, and hopefully that'll help all of us, whether we're new into the business or been in it a while, as we go forward with conserving wildlife in Alaska. The first thing I admonish is enjoy the journey. The destination comes way too fast. Be creative, and as Dave Klein said, have fun. It's all about having a good time. Take pictures, take lots of them. Write a book. Here's a couple of examples. Will Troyer's book about his life as a biologist in Alaska back in the 50s and 60s. And right next to it there, John Shane's recent book, Tongass Odyssey, about his life as a biologist working in Alaska and on the Tongass. If you get a chance, write a book. I hope to do so. Appreciate and seek to understand cultural diversity. And if you're going to be working in a cross-cultural environment, I strongly encourage you to enroll in cross-cultural classes. David James did it when he was in Kotzebue. Mike Spindler did it when he was in Kotzebue. Others have done it. I was encouraged to do it. It was huge in helping me and my efforts to interact with people in a setting that I wasn't familiar with. Involve the public. As Dave Klein suggested, seek opportunities to work internationally. You share ideas across national borders. That's a huge thing. Here's a photo of Nicholas Zelznov, who came to Alaska in the mid-'80s and helped us with some bear work on the Seward Peninsula. We learned from him, he learned from us, and took some of the techniques and things he learned back to Russia to help with their efforts. Maintain the high road and never compromise your integrity or credibility. Truth is, trust and credibility take a lifetime to build, but an instant to lose. Change can be good, embrace it. Diversity of ideas, personalities, races, gender can lead to better and more inclusive outcomes. Seek those. In failure and in fame, be humble. Can't overstate the value of humility. Politics can be messy. Don't take things personally. Luck is where preparation and opportunity come together. Be lucky. Practice diplomacy. Embrace practices such as the 7 habits of highly effective people. Begin with the end in mind. Seek first to understand and then to be understood. Put first things first. Seek win-win. Be proactive. Sharpen the saw. And as we've talked about today, synergize. Learn how to facilitate meetings and discussions. It's a wonderful tool. It's a wonderful tool both personally in your personal life as well as your professional life. I would strongly encourage anybody who has any interest at all to take this up. Whether you facilitate a meeting in the future or not, it's a great, great tool. Build trust and empower people. Seek opportunities to enhance leadership and team building skills. There's a lot of materials out there to select from. Look for those. Find ways to improve yourself. Seek common ground and pool resources to achieve shared goals. As others on the panel have said, and it's worth repeating, work closely with and through the Wildlife Society on issues where organizational roadblocks exist. The Wildlife Society is a great, great asset. As you've heard from panels about previous endeavors by TWS, it's been very effective and influential in many of the policies having to do with wildlife in Alaska. On a more personal basis, I will tell you this: muskoxen will charge. An undrugged 32-pound brown bear is more than 2 180-pound men can safely handle, and you never want to grab an undrugged otter by the tail. And finally, as Harry Truman said, it's what you learn after you know it all that counts. Thank you.
I was honored when Tom Paraguay asked me to join this panel, especially among the other distinguished presenters like Wini, Doug, Bob, and John. In considering what I would add, I thought it might be helpful to highlight some lessons learned during my career with Fish and Wildlife Service. I had the chance to work all over Alaska, from Attu Island in the Western Aleutians to the north coast of Arctic Refuge, and many points in between. I started as a field tech, spent most of the years as a pilot biologist, and ended up as a refuge manager. I was fortunate to be paid to fly airplanes all over Alaska in support of conservation work. The first lesson made my career easier and more enjoyable for all 41 years. It was helpful for me to explore how I got into this business and just what inside me kept me going all these years. My mother was a World War II refugee. Prior to the war, she had an idyllic early childhood, accompanying her father, a land surveyor, walking through the woods and farms of central Lithuania. She developed a deep love of nature that was interrupted by the horror of war. She would later make great efforts to ensure her family appreciated nature by organizing frequent camping trips. Since my earliest memories, I always preferred to be outdoors and in wild places. I also learned lessons about food security from my mother, who recalled being hungry most days during her 6 years as a war refugee. She valued food like no other parent I knew. That would later give me important insights into subsistence. I'd guess most members of the Wildlife Society cherish those special camping, hunting, or fishing trips with parents or relatives, who in turn passed on their love of planet Earth. It's a key to who we are. A challenge for all of us is to nurture our passion for conservation and not let it wither. It's essential we take time to keep these embers alive. A passion for conservation propelled me throughout my career. Likewise, our enthusiasm for conservation can be and should be shared with others. What's not to love about this photo of an Allakaket high school student getting to measure a chum salmon for the first time at a counting weir? This brings me to the next topic, mentoring the next generation. But first, some background. When I worked out of Galena in the west central interior, village elders spoke about declining white-fronted geese. We had only begun local surveys, so we lacked data that could provide answers. The continental monitoring efforts dating back many decades showed dramatically increased abundance of white fronts in the 1990s. During this period, managers were concerned about overabundant geese in some parts of North America. Snow geese and some Canada goose segments were overpopulated and had become a nuisance. Regulators were focused on ways to increase harvest. Once we had some local data, the decline elders spoke about was scientifically evident. Then the finger pointing began. Managers and hunters in the lower 48 were quick to blame the other. Managers blamed subsistence hunting in Alaska because it occurs during the nesting season. And in turn, villagers in Alaska blamed the lower 48 sport hunters. With the overall white front population growing, I wondered what could explain the opposite trend in our area. The cause could be anywhere in their life cycle. The Alaskan nesting grounds, the fall staging areas in the prairies of Saskatchewan and Texas, or the wintering areas from the Gulf Coast to the central highlands of northern Mexico. We did not know whether this was caused by hunting mortality, disease, or habitat conditions, so a multi-pronged approach was needed. I recruited a number of volunteers, technicians, and interns to help with the project. I'd like to highlight a few who have moved on to do some really inspiring things. We brought some Mexican students north as volunteers to help with nesting studies. Our goal was to inspire them to return home and study our geese on the wintering grounds in Mexico. And it worked. Fabiola Yepez did her master's on wintering geese in northeast Mexico, and then went on to earn a PhD. She's now a professor teaching remote sensing at the University of Nuevo León in Monterrey, Mexico. Manuel Ochoa earned a master's studying winter geese in the central highlands of Mexico. He then worked for Ducks Unlimited Mexico and is now managing a large private conservation area. Fairbanks resident Deborah Webb completed her master's at University of Alaska Fairbanks, studying migration with satellite telemetry and VHF collars. She now works for Fish and Wildlife Service in Fairbanks. Jean Fujikawa, originally from Hawaii, spent 3 seasons at Galena studying songbirds, geese, and doing GIS analyses. She went to the Main Islands National Wildlife Refuge and is now studying Hawaiian invasive species on the island of Oahu. Jenny Bryant's hometown is Galena. She was hired right out of high school as a tech to help with all types of surveys. She completed her bachelor's at UAF and works as a wildlife inventory biologist for Fish and Wildlife at Galena. PJ Simon, originally from the village of Allakaket, was hired as a tech to help on marten, fire ecology studies, and all types of aerial and ground surveys. He became a tribal leader at Allakaket, then a Doyon board member, and is now chairman of Tanana Chiefs Conference. Several of these folks told me their experiences at Galena changed their lives for the better. I was privileged to be mentored by some great biologists and pilots in my early years. They helped me develop a passion for conservation, good science, and aviation safety. I decided that I should pay it forward by mentoring others. I earned my flight instructor rating and mentored many pilots new to conservation work. Now back to the white fronts. That was the toughest wildlife management challenge I faced. It took more than a decade to address this through studies, relationship building, and negotiations with Central Flyway participants. Leg banding analyses showed the interior Alaska birds had lower survival than the Arctic, Alaskan, and Canadian nesters. Satellite radio telemetry indicated the interior birds arrived 2 to 3 weeks earlier than the Arctic nesters throughout their life cycle. We learned that our interior Alaska birds were subject to greater hunting mortality in Saskatchewan and Texas compared to the other segments. As a result of our work, regulations were changed in 2008 to roll back the liberalized harvest. When the population's 3-year moving average went below a threshold of 600,000, regulations would get conservative. A 3-year moving average greater than 700,000 would be needed before regulations could become more liberal. Within a few years, the interior Alaska regional population of white fronts recovered. Subsistence hunters reported increased success and publicly thanked the agencies. I learned several important lessons during this journey. If you're convinced by the data, be persistent, be patient, but never give up. And be willing to swim against the current if it's the right thing to do. Even with the local trend data clearly showing a decline, it was challenging for me to make a case within my agency. After all, the bulk of the population nesting on the North Slope and in the Canadian Arctic was growing. Plus, it was difficult to convince the other Central Flyway participants that a localized goose population in Alaska needed special treatment. Similarly, when the Canudi Refuge Management Plan was revised, there were demands for increased fire suppression in old-growth spruce lichen woodlands near the village of Allakaket. Fire managers wanted natural fire so hazardous fuels would not accumulate. Wildlife managers wanted old growth converted to early succession habitats to benefit moose. Both are good goals. The perspective in the villages affected by these decisions was very different. People overwhelmingly believed that too much of the local area had already burned. The fire interval had increased. In some areas of Canudi and Yukon Flats refuges, 15-year-old burns were reburning again in dry summers. It got my attention when villagers described how this impacted their sense of well-being. People said they felt exposed and in more potential danger if they had problems transiting the open windswept recent burns by snow-go or dog team in wintertime. Conversely, they felt safer while traveling through an old-growth white or black spruce forest. And even though they depend on moose, they also value the marten and caribou habitat provided by old growth. We reached a compromise. Fire suppression levels would be set to achieve a goal of no more than 5% old growth burned annually in a special protection area near the village. During my work with white-fronted geese, I learned that risky ideas sometimes turn out to be very good solutions. Back in 1995, I began an oral history project to learn more about subsistence use of geese. When I saw the need to gather traditional ecological knowledge, the Fish and Wildlife Service leadership unfortunately was skeptical of the value. I lacked my supervisor's support, so I volunteered to use vacation time and weekends to record interviews, edit and archive the tapes. Fortunately, I received support and advice from the local public radio station and the UAF library. This is not to diminish the importance of good Western science. Both ways of knowing should be deployed. As it turned out, indigenous knowledge pointed to the need for further investigation. And Western science convinced regulators that harvest reductions were necessary. That will nearly always be the case, which brings us to Lesson 6. Continue, encourage, and support good science and science-based management. I'd like to highlight some recent examples in which the Northwest Boreal Partnership facilitated state-of-the-art landscape science for government land planning. The first example is analysis of habitat connectivity. Land facets and enduring features were modeled to point out important habitat connections between conservation system units. This work is being considered for inclusion in a BLM resource management plan. We supported Charlotte Gabrielson, a UAF postdoc, to explore how connectivity corridors follow climate gradients in the landscape. This information is being used by the Yukon Territorial Government as they consider additional protected areas. Maintenance of habitat connectivity can increase resilience as wildlife and habitats adjust to a changing climate. Ecological benchmarks will become increasingly important. Alaska is fortunate that almost 40% of our total land area is set aside as protected areas, mainly federal parks, refuges, wilderness areas, and state parks. There are forces at work to undermine protection within these conservation units. The remaining 60% of Alaska's lands are state-owned, regional or village native corporations, or federal multiple-use lands where development is permitted. Parts of the Statehood Act, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act intended for these lands to be economic drivers. In a decarbonized future, they may become more important to our economy than the North Slope oil fields. Existing protected areas can serve as ecological benchmarks in a controlled experiment. The lands subjected to development and resource extraction are the treatments in the experiment. The protected areas are the controls. A draft BLM plan proposes to do just this. As we consider development scenarios unfolding in Alaska, we need to know how well the existing protected areas could serve as controls. Are they in the right places? Are they representative of habitats such that valid comparisons can be made? As this development occurs, we should be considering how these effects can best be monitored and managed. Cooperation and partnerships are hugely important. This slide highlights a project in the late 1980s when I worked closely with Doug Larsen, another member of this panel. 4 agencies pooled resources to study wolves because each could never have afforded such work on their own. In my experience, project outcomes usually improved through such cooperation. Beginning with my first permanent job at Arctic Refuge in the 1970s, we worked with biologists of the Canadian Wildlife Service and Yukon Territorial Government to study border-crossing critters like snow geese and caribou. When planning to follow them across the border, we only needed to telephone the customs office for clearance. Sadly, that part is much more difficult now. I hope many of you have had the satisfaction of doing similar cooperative studies. They usually generate a lot of goodwill and produce good science. About 10 years ago, we similarly pooled resources for a large-scale moose collaring project in the Upper Kayakuk. But by this time, there were more bureaucratic challenges than earlier years. Nevertheless, in the divisive politics of these days, it's critical that agency leadership at the director and commissioner level continue to support this kind of work. In my last few years as a refuge manager, I was asked to initiate a new collaborative called the Northwest Boreal Partnership. It was one of the landscape conservation cooperatives that have gone away. I remained active with them since I retired. We bring together more than 20 organizations in a neutral convening forum. We've flourished because of strong collaboration and a resolve to never give up. Despite the budget cuts of the last 4 years, our neutrality has become important to partners as natural resource issues become more and more divisive. Finally, lesson number 8. I always tried to leave things better than I found them. I applied this to my own studies, or if I was added to a team doing a study, and when I worked on a field facility or participated in developing a management plan. Sometimes people would say, that's good enough for government work, and try and skate by. But I tried to turn that into an opportunity to improve the situation and leave it better than I found it, whether it was a campsite, an airplane cockpit, or a whole wildlife refuge. Thanks a lot, and I wish I could be there in person for this.
This portion of the panel is inspired by COVID-19. I'm Wini Kessler, a 48-year member in the Wildlife Society. For 6 of those years, I represented you as the Northwest Section Representative to Council, and I was TWS President in 2012 and 13. I'm a TWS Fellow and recipient of the Aldo Leopold Memorial Award. This pandemic shows just how much we've taken mundane things for granted. We didn't fully appreciate having friends over or gathering for TWS conferences until those things were no longer possible. It's been a real wake-up call for all of us. There are real parallels in my life as a wildlife professional. Most of my career was spent in the US, mainly in Alaska, where I was involved in many of the messy issues you've heard about today. The rest of my career has been in British Columbia, where I reside today and remain active in wildlife conservation. Alaska and BC have many of the same wildlife species and ecosystems on a mostly public land base. But there's huge differences that shape how the issues play out. In Canada, the Constitution assigns power over land and natural resources to the provinces. Thus, the BC government controls the 94% of the land base that is Crown land. And in the last century, it delegated forest management to the timber industry through long-term tenures and timber licenses in exchange for industry's commitment to build and operate mills. It's sort of like Alaska's 50-year contracts, but for longer time frames and encompassing most of the forested landscape. A caveat now. Please be clear that my comments are not intended to judge BC's resource management against Alaska's. Their respective countries have very different histories and political systems and cultures. But here's the thing. Living and working in BC has enabled me to see Alaska's issues in a whole new light. I thought this unique angle would be worth sharing, if for nothing else, to get you thinking from a different perspective. So the first wake-up call I'll share concerns the role of protective environmental laws. In Alaska, as in all states, there's a national framework of solid environmental laws that apply to the public lands that federal agencies must comply with. These laws also set the standard for environmental protection on non-federal lands, although states may pass even stricter laws, and those standards would then apply. It's very different in BC. There exist federal laws that might sound similar. For instance, the Species at Risk Act, a federal law in Canada, might be likened to the US's Endangered Species Act. But Canada's federal laws, such as Species at Risk Act, do not apply to the 94% of BC that is provincial crown land. And since BC has no provincial laws for species at risk, there's a huge gap in protection. I'll now illustrate why federal environmental laws matter, using a high-profile issue during my term as the Director of Wildlife and Fish for the Forest Service Alaska region. And that Alaska is the Kensington mine, just a little bit north of Juneau. The mine's permit to operate on the Tongass National Forest hinged on one major question. Would the mines plan to store wastewater in this unassuming little body of water here, Lower Slate Lake? Would that violate provisions of the federal Clean Water Act? This question brought intense scrutiny to the project, all the way to the US Supreme Court, who found that the mine could proceed. But a treatment plant is in place to clean the wastewater before it enters the lake. Such scrutiny under the Clean Water Act keeps the unthinkable from happening. In BC, the absence of such scrutiny means that the unthinkable can and did happen. The Mount Polley mine disaster of 2014 is the largest mining disaster in Canadian history. A breached tailings pond sent 24 million cubic meters of mine waste into Quesnel Lake and other important waterways. The BC government had 3 years to file charges under the province's laws, the Environmental Management Act and the Mines Act, but chose not to do so. Here's the point. In reflecting back, I see that Alaska's messy issues were and still are embedded within a protective framework of solid federal laws. I'll never again take those laws for granted, and I don't think you should either. Moving on to my next wake-up call. In Alaska, people take seriously their right to be meaningfully involved in public agency decisions, a right that is featured prominently in the National Environmental Protection Act. Complementing this right to be involved is the right of citizens to hold government accountable for complying with its own laws. These rights account for the long, messy record in Alaska of COWCH and the Sierra Club, Audubon Society, and others in appealing national forest plans, timber sales, and other decisions. And when necessary, taking the agency to court to challenge the legality of agency decisions. American citizens have powerful standing to hold their government accountable, and Alaskans exercise that right fully. Comparable opportunities to weigh in on agency decisions and to litigate government for non-compliance do not exist in the Canadian context. To sue the government, you'd have to clearly establish that a violation of your legal rights has resulted in financial or other harm. This rarely happens, except in the case of Canada's First Nations. The First Nations have specific rights to land, subsistence resources, and cultural customs that are protected in Canada's Constitution. And court decisions in recent decades have given the First Nations increasing powers to influence natural resource decisions. One example of their success, in partnership with several environmental groups, was getting the BC government's agreement to permanently protect 85% of remaining intact forest from logging in the Great Bear Rainforest. Securing this 6.4 million hectare area was a singular opportunity to protect old growth in BC because the rest is essentially gone or scheduled for harvest. Now, here's the point. Reflecting back, I greatly appreciate how Alaskans of all stripes have weighed in on land use decisions and held the agencies accountable for meeting their legal requirements. I'll never again take those citizen powers for granted, and I don't think you should either. My next wake-up call is the realization that no matter how messy Alaska's issues may be, they are solidly informed by research findings, data, and expert knowledge. We heard much about this today as panelists have shared their career highlights. Alaska has a solid track record of recruiting and retaining top-notch wildlife professionals and of producing, often through collaborative efforts, a rich and continuous legacy of biological information to support wildlife management programs and decisions. All this is possible because of a brilliant idea that was enacted in 1937 as the Pittman-Robertson Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act. The taxes on sporting equipment collected by the federal government and leveraged by hunting license revenues provide a stable funding stream for wildlife surveys and inventories, research, habitat acquisition and restoration, and much more. How might wildlife management fare in the absence of stable and dedicated funding? The answer is with extreme difficulty. That is why the PR system is the envy of provincial agencies and nonprofits alike in Canada. In BC and other provinces, most money from the sale of wildlife licenses and permits goes into general revenues. Thus, wildlife management must compete against all other provincial priorities, such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Always underfunded, BC's wildlife agencies are hard-pressed to retain staff positions, let alone to carry out core functions such as population surveys, habitat inventories, and essential research. This lingering pandemic makes me appreciate more than ever the secure funding enabled by PR. With economies everywhere under tremendous stress, wildlife management is unlikely to emerge as a critical need. Thankfully, in the US, the PR Trust Fund will continue to support the essential work of state wildlife management. I will never take that for granted again, and you shouldn't either. My final example concerns the messiest of my job responsibilities as the Alaska Regional Director, and that is subsistence management. Now, the objective seems simple enough. To ensure that Alaskans who most need wildlife and fish for subsistence purposes have access to them. But getting there requires a federal program and a state program, each with its own complexities. I know the federal program best. It is a bottom-up approach in which regional advisory councils, populated by rural subsistence users and supported by teams of biologists, social scientists, and anthropologists, deliberate all sorts of proposed changes to subsistence hunting and fishing regulations. The advisory councils integrate science and traditional knowledge to empower users and to inform decisions of the Federal Subsistence Management Board. The approach in Canada is totally different. Canada's Indigenous peoples have priority rights to wildlife and fish that are protected in Section 35 of the Constitution of Canada. Indigenous people are therefore exempt from provincial hunting regulations such as season, sex, and bag limits, and from licensing and reporting requirements. This facilitates the free exercise of their traditional hunting and cultural practices. But it does complicate wildlife management. We all know how unlicensed illegal hunting, poaching, introduces error into the data sets and models that support wildlife management. In Canada, biologists must contend with the additional substantial source of uncertainty that stems from unlicensed and unreported legal hunting. And imagine the challenge to conservation officers endeavoring to carry out enforcement where part of the hunting population is subject to license and regulatory requirements and part is not. I hope my examples have given you some food for thought. Let me now cut to the chase on how I see wildlife management in Alaska. While it's true that Alaska's issues play out in convoluted ways, the messiness actually provides intense scrutiny, checks and balances, and offers diverse possible outcomes. I miss that messiness in my continuing efforts to advance wildlife conservation in the Canadian context. Here in BC, the issues tend to be cut and dried, decisions unscrutinized, and there are frustratingly few opportunities to influence outcomes. I'll close with some comments about the Wildlife Society, which has been a huge part of my career for many reasons. But a key reason is the Society's respected role in speaking for wildlife and informing policy choices. Earlier, I discussed how special it is that American citizens can weigh in on decisions and hold agencies accountable. Perhaps you don't feel you have that power because of your employment with an agency or a company, for example. But you can support the Society's policy mission, whether it's helping write a technical review or a position statement, reviewing proposed plans, or alerting TWS policy staff to an emerging issue. You can help them to be a powerful and respected voice for the wildlife you care about. I'll repeat a point I made earlier. Americans should never take for granted their power as citizens and their capacity to influence outcomes. Especially in Alaska, those stakes for wildlife are very high. Please don't squander that amazing potential. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share my COVID-inspired reflections.